Hello. Welcome again to the Embodied Faith podcast. I am Geoff Holsclaw, and we're seeking to integrate neuroscience, spiritual formation, and faith. As always, this is brought to you by Grassroots Christianity, which is growing faith for everyday people. Many of us spend our days feeling like we have all the problems and everyone else has their act together. We feel like we aren't achieving what we're supposed to. We're not living up to our potential. But what if a higher self-esteem is not the answer? What if maybe that's the problem? But what if a lower anthropology could save the day? That's what we're talking about today, how a low anthropology might actually be better for us. I'm really excited to have David Zahl on today on the Embodied Faith podcast. He is the founder and director of Mockingbird Ministries, the co-host of the Mocking Cast. He is also the author of Seculosity, subtitled How Career, Parenting, Technology, Food, Politics, and Romance Become Our New Religion and What to Do About it. And thankfully, his next book, which we're talking about today, Low Anthropology, has a much shorter subtitle. But David, thank you so much for coming on today.
I'm so glad to be here, Geoff. It's great to hear your voice and rattling off that excessively long subtitle. You did a great job with it.
I'm sure that was your publisher's idea. You had nothing to do with it.
It actually was. I was like, they're like, if you're going to use a neologism to title this book, we've got to tell people what it's about.
That's true. Yeah. Well, good. Okay, so let's cut to the chase. I was raised in California. In the 80s and 90s when the self-esteem movement was just at peak self-esteem. They were the best at self-esteem. I didn't learn much in school. I don't know how to spell, but I feel really good about that. And I'm very confident when I misspell things. And so reading your book, you seem to want to take that all away from me. And I want to know why. Why do you want to take my high self-esteem away from me and catapult me in the despairs of a low anthropology?
Well, first of all, I don't. I want you to feel great about yourself, because the book is not it's not a vehicle for self-loathing. I really think the opposite is true. But there was an article, about, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years ago that was in the Atlantic Monthly. It was a huge article. It actually got turned into a book or something of a book called How to Land Your Kid in Therapy. It was Lori Gottlieb wrote it, and it was about, she said that she had seen a generation of young people enter her office with basically having had a nervous breakdown in the mid-20s because they had been so sheltered from any experience of failure or any experience of their own lack, and they'd been told so aggressively that they were super special and there was nothing wrong with them, and the only limitations they had were the ones they put on themselves. And parents had, out of love, I think, tried to spin every setback as an actual victory, and they'd never been allowed to experience any negativity, in other words. And she said that what she saw in these people was that they felt that I had been lied to, but mainly they felt that they were struggling with a acute perfectionism. And the fallout of that was sort of a sense of existential loneliness. They were the only ones who were screwed up. All of their peers had it together. If anyone found out how much they were really just stitching it together, they lived in fear of that sort of imposter syndrome. And so I found that to be true of my own peers. I grew up in the same setting of what, under the rubric of high self-esteem, what was very often communicated. And I want to say that all of that sort of approach was done out of, I feel it was done out of a love, and who wants their kid to feel badly about themselves?
Of course.
But it had a way of creating a neurosis around, or what today is basically called entitlement. Like that I think that I am deserving of everything good, and that I'm God's gift to the world. And while also a splitting, because you're leading another life in which there's the real you and then there's the public you, and all sorts of things. So that woke me up. That article woke me up to realizing, oh my gosh, this isn't some niche thing that I'm dealing with in terms of like privileged kids on the East
Yeah.
Coast, but it's more of a larger fallout from that kind of sunny optimism, or at least almost a militaristic defense against uh, anything sad, bad, or mad.
Mhm. Which are like the 3 of the 5 core emotions. Well, just so that you don't feel too sad, mad, or bad, I just want you to know that right away, Josh Redder jumped in and said that he loves you. And so,
Oh,
so if that positivity could just carry through to the rest of this interview, that would be great.
well, I love
So
him too.
I think I remember reading that same article, which was something like, "There's no greater burden than the burden of finding your happiness," where parents would tell children about career choices and college choices and romantic, like, just do what makes you happy, which sounds so positive and affirming, right? You want your children to be happy, but it's vague, and it feels like a crushing weight. Well, am I happy? Am I doing what makes me happy? Well, if I made a change, would that make me more happy or less? And then just becomes this huge, because the idea is that you should be happy. And if you're not happy, then something is wrong. I don't know if that's the same article. I think it was.
No,
But
it's your fault. You are to blame. Yeah.
yeah. And so that becomes the accidental secondary message of what you're calling a high anthropology. So could you just unpack a little bit what you mean by a high anthropology?
Yeah, sure. The anthropology, I'm not using it like a cultural anthropologist would, or as someone shopping for, boho chic uh, housewares. It's not about the study of small tribes in the tundra or something like that. Uh, I'm talking about anthropology is the way philosophers and theologians use it, which is simply what do you mean? What's your operating view of human nature? What do you mean when you use the phrase "I'm only human"? That is your anthropology. What do you think human beings are good at? What are they not good at? What are they capable of? What are they incapable of? So a high anthropology is basically the default in at least the culture in which I was raised. I can't speak for everyone because I recognize, especially people from religious backgrounds, grow up in a much more negative view, or a kind of a wagging finger. But the high anthropology would say that yes, the only limits that you face are the ones that you put on yourself. That you are defined by your greatest achievements. That you can sort of do it all and be it all. And a lot of times these messages aren't overt, but that is the implicit message that you can that you are capable of a great deal. Now, one of the ways you're living in a culture of high anthropology is I think, and in fact, this book was born out of this observation, and in fact, my own suffering. I mean, we're all sort of high anthropologists by nature, I think. Uh, but it was the combination of burnout, which is this at this point, it's almost like a hackneyed idea, but everyone for at least a few years there before the pandemic and during the pandemic, everyone was talking about burnout. Today, it's more like fatigue. But this widespread sense that we were living lives that demanded more of us than we were capable of delivering, and that had to do with our economically, our jobs. It had to do with our relationships. It had to do with our time, and it's spiritually too. I think so you'd hear about middle schoolers being burned out, and you would hear about young mothers being burned out, and you would hear about men in their 50s being burned out, and everyone was sort of burned out. And it was not just they were exhausted; they were sort of paralyzed or put upon feeling sort of betrayed almost. That they were told that they could do something they were physically incapable of doing. Uh, so that's burnout is one of the cultural conditions that I was addressing, and the other one would be loneliness, which is often generated by this never allowing yourself to be known. That's what
Yeah.
people who are lonely. There's an intolerance of weakness, and so you saw these books that would come out, lots of books about the power of vulnerability, and I'm talking about Brene Brown, but other people would piggyback on this, and I generally think those are really pretty good. That's a good development. But there was a sort of a cry of the heart that I'm under so much demand of the burden of perfectionism is too much. And in order to forge real relationships, in order to feel known, we must be open, not about the best things about us, but what we struggle with, what we fail at, and what we are, where we fall short. And that's where known, that's where you feel known, and that's where you feel loved. And so loneliness, burnout are symptomatic of a high anthropology that says show no weakness and keep grinding, and no rest for the weary.
Yeah. So the way you're using it, a high anthropology sounds like some combination of like pop psychology and affirmation, self-help literature, corporate productivity culture, and effectiveness, and then kind of the sense that, well, your life is up to you, and how it
Yeah.
turns out is your responsibility, which really does come from certain streams of like positive psychology and other things. Like you are the captain of your own life, right? And so that sounds good on the one hand, but you're kind of noticing, and we're as a culture is saying, well, actually, look at all these symptoms that a lifetime of that message creates, where we're pushing our physical limitations, we're expecting so much of ourselves and others, and these types of things. So, because I come from like fundamentalism, and I'm in
Mhm.
conversations with people coming out of fundamentalism, and they would say, well, I had a low anthropology, and it was receiving a more positive view of myself that actually saved and helped me
Yeah.
move out of that, which I think in a certain circles is true. And if you were raised in a really traumatic or abusive environment, that is, that's terrible. And it is true that building your self-esteem or having a higher view of yourself is the work of self-care and of development. But broadly, I think what I hear you saying broadly as a culture, we're built to have a high anthropology. Like that's like the marketing, the corporate, that's the messages we're getting all the time, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the tensions in the book, and I try to talk about it in a lot of different ways. But there is very much a way in which low anthropology, which is sort of the sense that you are a limited creature, there's God and you're not God, uh, and that you're limited and that you're conflicted. Are tied in all sorts of knots, and you're an emotional creature. This is all founded on social science. You don't need a theology degree to know this, and that there is a dark side to human nature. There is what I would call original sin in this case. I would call I still call it self-centeredness. But if you don't have some appreciation of there being an actual dark of my child occasionally just wanting to inflict pain, you're going to be baffled and disappointed and actually resentful of people. So that said, there are those who grew up in a what I would call a not low enough anthropology that said you are terrible. Now stop it. You are awful, and you are a worm, and now stop it. So as a Christian, you somehow have the power within yourself to not be so limited, to not be so self-centered, and to not be um, so conflicted. And that pits a person against themselves and creates enormous amounts of shame and self-loathing. One of the key lines in the beginning of the book is, it is not shame-inducing and defeating to say that I cannot do it all, be it all, care about it all, and always do exactly what I'm told. What is shame-inducing and defeating is the idea that I just haven't pulled it off yet.
And I think that's the great twist that I think is really important, is that certainly you and I, were engaged in pastoral ministry, as well as, theology and academic and psychology and all these things. Like, we don't want people to be filled with shame, and we don't want people to be self-loathing.
No.
So we'll just agree with that baseline.
Hmm.
Uh, but what you're trying to say is, well, the best psychology, and maybe even, theology, uh, knows that we have a low anthropology, or knows that we're just people. And that actually it's a high anthropology that is most shame inducing,
Hmm.
and that it's a high expectation kind of environment that creates the most self-loathing. Even in general. And I think that that's something we need as a society to grapple with as we kind of think through these things. So what is the shape of a low? In section 2 or part 2 of your book, you talk about the shape of low anthropology. So what is the shape? You just rattled off a couple of those 3 things, but why is accepting limitations good for us and an example of a low anthropology?
Oh, and by the way, if people who did grow up in that fundamentalist sort of absolute no, that kind of condemnatory situation, I do think it can be very therapeutic and helpful to be reminded that they're created in God's image and that they have something positive to contribute. And like that is earth shattering
Absolutely.
to people who have somehow gotten in their head that they don't. It's more. I'm talking. There's a slight cultural specificity here where I'm talking about those of us who think I'm the only one with problems. I'm the only one who struggles. Like that's what a high anthropology inculcates in people. The shape of a low anthropology. So people sometimes say, "Or is this just a euphemism for total depravity or original sin?" And it's
Right.
not. It includes a notion of sin. Total depravity, I think, by the way, just linguistically is completely degraded. I don't think it makes no sense. Like in terms of, it only comes across as you suck. Like that's that.
Right.
I've stopped trying to, and I'm not a Calvinist, so I also don't feel any kind of uh, ownership of that title. It has done a ton of damage. Um, uh, so a low anthropology has 3 pillars as I see it. And the first one is limitation, which is this idea that we are limited by what we can do and by what we can know. So we are limited by things like time. You cannot be in 2 places at once, as anyone who's got kids knows. And we are limited by biology. Like we've got bodies that need sleep, that need food. There's a simple sense in which there are firm limits on what we are capable of. But there's also epistemological modesty, what I would say, like that we're high anthropology world is the world of certainty, and I have complete mastery and comprehensive knowledge of X, Y, and Z. Low anthropology is actually that you cannot have full comprehensive knowledge of anything. Like that, just by nature of your context and your perspective, there's always some. You may have 99.9% of the facts, but there's always the possibility that you don't have all of them. And again, there is a God, and it's not you. So there's a modesty about what we can know. That's limitation, and I think that. I mean, what does that look like in practice? It means I can. I think sometimes it means the difference between taking up arms and not violence and no violence. If I'm 100% certain I'm right about something, and I'm 100% certain you're wrong about something, well, then what excuse is there for me not to employ every means at my disposal to prevent you? A low anthropology says there might still be something I can learn from you, even if I don't think so. I have to know epistemologically, or that I am going to be limited in what I'm. It doesn't mean I can't feel strongly or almost certain about things, but could cut 1% out of my certainty off would not be a bad thing. Limitation is simply the idea that it's okay to be a person with limits. Like that me needing sleep or getting sick occasionally is not evidence of some sort of exceptional weakness on my part. It's just sort of proof that I'm a human being. So that is the first pillar. The second pillar is what I call doubleness, and this is that our lives, we're not just limited in terms of capacity, but agency. So it's the Romans 7, or the inside out experience of reality, that anyone who's struggled with addiction knows all too well. That people are emotional creatures, and that we are not. We are intellectual creatures as well, but that's secondary. Which means we're a jumble of feelings, and there's competing forces that are at work within us, such that we don't always understand ourselves. We are a mystery to ourselves, and that misbehavior is not always a matter of information or education. That misbehavior is usually a matter. It has to do with desire, and this is an Augustinian attempt at if you want to understand someone, figure out what they love, figure out what they want. And that's the key to understanding people. But it means in practice that we can be very uh, complicated. And it doesn't mean that we always want to do the wrong thing, though. Yes, it does mean that, and it does. Um, it means I'm not as free as I think I am. That I'm constrained. I mean, if you're sort of a social progressive, you can think about it in terms I'm constrained by society and my circumstances and biases and all of these things. Uh, but there's some sort of I'm not just a free agent making healthy choices, and I think that's a absolute key to understanding other people and not completely batting your head against the wall when you told them. And as a person in ministry, like I've told them what they need to do. I've spelled it out clearly. Why won't they do it?
Because that always works. Yeah.
Because that always works. It doesn't work. So that's doubleness or conflictedness. And thirdly is self-centeredness, which is a sin, or is my euphemism for that. There is something about us that the things that we do desire often come at a cost to other people and even ourselves, and that our best interests are not always that somehow our desires are disordered. And there is a moral component to this, which is unavoidable, and I guess it's unfashionable, and it's where a lot of the books about vulnerability and limitation stop. But until I don't think we're capable of loving or understanding other people unless we understand that there is also this, what I would call, bias against flourishing, that seems to afflict us, even those of us who've been set free from the weaponized versions of low anthropology. We still sometimes just want to do something because we want to do it, and to hell with what other people think, So
Right.
that's we see that playing out collectively in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, my siblings were always like, when Jeffrey was when he was 6, he would get that look, and we just knew he was about to destroy all the stuff we'd spend an hour building.
Exactly.
It's like, I don't know, like, why did I do that? I don't know. Was I listening to the demons inside of me? Was I, giving into some primal urges? I don't know.
The imp of the perverse. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so you just explained, a lot of the reasons why this podcast is called Embodied Faith is because our bodies create limitations. So you were talking about, there's food limitations, there's sleep limitations, there's just extended in space and time limitations. I can't jump really high, so I have basketball limitations. I can't just wish those away, So our culture, technologically speaking, and kind of our corporate and kind of, marketing consumption world basically is live without limitations. You have light bulbs, you have music, you can stay up all night. You don't have to sleep, just keep going. Right. We have all sorts of remedies. I have coffee, like you drink, we can do all this. We can make it all happen. Right. And so our Western world, especially technological world, says you can live without limitations, and you're saying, well, actually that's a high anthropology kind of view. A low anthropology says we need to accept our limitations. And then similarly, we're embodied. So we have like this churning emotional life that is just undeniable. And, like, I think that's what you're saying is partly why I think, at least in my circles, like internal family systems, parts theory is just taking off therapeutically as well as kind of popularly, is because people are grappling with like, yeah, I have conflicted motivations. I have different parts of me. I want to go out. No, I want to stay home. I want to chew my boss's head off. No, I'd rather not because I want my promotion, right? We have different parts that are at war. And I think a low anthropology is always taking that seriously. Like you're not, the goal isn't to live your best life now. It's just to kind of live, let's just live and let's be honest, So anyhow, I think that you're just kind of explaining, I'm just kind of linking, what you're doing with the title of this podcast. So how then, just to kind of start wrapping up. So is there any good news in all this? Like, how do we move forward? Like, how is this good for us? You mentioned living with yourself, relationships, religion, and politics. You don't have to go over all that. Like, we could maybe just like end with the last one. Like, how does a low anthropology help our relationship to our own selves, and then maybe like our relationships?
Well, I think a low anthropology it approaches the self with a healthy self-suspicion, not a self-condemnation, but a sort of a I can
Humility.
humility. I can contain multitudes, and it's this very anxious search for the authentic self can take on, at least in my own experience and the lives of other people, can take on a very oppressive uh, color. And low anthropology sort of says you're not just strictly one thing or the other, and like that's okay. And you are wonderful in a lot of ways, and in a lot of ways, which you're a complete basket case. And like that's to have any kind of healthy relationship with yourself. Both of those, neither of those can be sort of legislated against, while also not being. I think the great fruit of low anthropology is unity. Like I understand that we are not, perhaps we don't agree on certain virtues. We have different values, but I can know I can love you the second I realize that, like me, you fall short of your values. Like you don't always live up to them. That's like bridge is weakness or loss. By the fact that we're both getting older, we both have lost things, and then all of a sudden sympathy is like that. So there's a great fruit of love and sympathy and unity, empathy. And ultimately, though, and I'd go through other things, curiosity, there's always something more to learn. I think faith is the great fruit of low anthropology, that I need help. I need help from other people. So it's an invitation to collaboration and friendship and community. But I also need help. Ultimately, I need help from God. Such is my predicament, that I need help from God. I need deliverance. I need redemption, and I need sustenance from God. And that I don't think Christianity makes a huge amount of sense without, in the context of a high anthropology. But in the terms of a low anthropology, you get into communities of faith, or like think of AA, where people who are those are transformative communities, and they're other-centered, service communities that begin with the low anthropology. You do not move beyond your sort of basic identity as an alcoholic, and yet we watch as people, all sorts of amazing things happen, and we reach out to other people in solidarity, and we kind of start to dwell on ourselves a little less. And that's the roadmap to freedom. But ultimately, I'm trying to paint a picture I'm trying to make a case for why faith in God would be not just compelling but urgent. And if you're a person who has the answers, or who only needs a slap on the back or a pat on the back occasionally, like why look to God? But if you're a person who is tied in knots, and sometimes does the wrong thing just for the thrill of it, and is dealing with inherited biases and conditions that are not neutral, that like hurt people socially, but also hurt the depression that I feel my wife and kids have to deal with it. I mean, you can empathize with me, but like, who's gonna go out and get groceries? So it's I really see this as the gateway, not in and of itself, like a low anthropology without some sense of God. I believe can lead to nihilism, not cynicism. Cynicism is sort of a certainty about other people, whereas the low anthropology says, actually, I can never be completely certain about my spouse or my child or myself. But I believe that it ultimately is the beginning. I say a low anthropology produces a high Christology, and the great saints of history are sort of view themselves as more dependent and smaller, and God is larger. And I found it to be very good news as I age, and many of my own capabilities and capacities just diminish by nature of my body decaying. So, sorry, I'm preaching. But
Oh no, that's great. Well, that's what I kind of wanted to end with, is how do we cultivate like communities of a low anthropology, not loathsome, shame-filled communities? Because usually those are ones that are expecting the most, expecting perfectionism, wrapped in the verbiage of holiness or purity or something like that, or the perfect, charismatic experience or something like that. But how can we, what do churches of a low anthropology look like? It seems like confession and repentance is pretty basic, right? That's just your declaring out loud your own limitations, failures, your own veering away from the ideals that we hold to be, important for us. And then, the embrace of that, right?
Yeah, I think a great church service is a great church embraces the technologies of the heart, music is a technology of the heart, storytelling is a technology of the heart, but liturgy at its best. You come into my church, at least, you hear about God from whom no secrets are hid, all desires known. You're like, oh, really? Whew. And then you get to the confession where you talk about the things we've done and left undone, and we've not loved our neighbor as ourselves. And then in light of that reality, you are told that God loves you and that you are forgiven on account of his son, and you're invited to the table to receive. Now, everyone has a different tradition and different liturgies, but I think that basic rhythm is a beautiful one, because at the end, after you've received forgiveness, absolution, communion, all on the same level, we're all on our knees, then you're sent out into the world to do the good works God has prepared in advance for you to do. Sort of like the world becomes a surprise party. You start to look at, you're like, wow, given what I'm like, given what other people are like, how amazing is it that so many wonderful things are on offer? And here's a place where I can serve another person, or here's a place where look at these acts of beauty and kindness. It's a difference between approaching the world resentful for it not living up to your expectations versus grateful and in awe and wonder at the majesty of the surprise of God's grace.
Mm. And so in that sense, like a worship service or just a community, like you say, that take, if we want to use this theology, that takes sin, seriously, or the sin situation, or a low anthropologist, the limitations of humanity, it actually creates more spontaneous moments of awe and wonder and appreciation for the world, for others, whether that's just empathy for others' weaknesses, but then also for their achievements. Oh, like, that's so amazing where you came from and that you were able to accomplish all these things, or wow, like you're doing so great today. This is a good day for you. And just being able to celebrate all these things. It sounds counterintuitive that the lower we view ourselves and others actually creates the more joy and wonder in our interactions.
Yeah, God has given people different gifts. He's given us very similar weaknesses, but the different gifts, and you can sort of sit around and say, "Wow, I can't do that. Here's my blind spot." Collaboration becomes all of a sudden like a key to Christian living, and you can't do it alone. And yeah, you start to just be in awe of this tapestry that's around you, while also not being surprised when things go south, or when there's a glitch, or the processor throws up an error. So I believe it's a wonderful way to also not take yourself totally seriously, and still think that God is in the business of sort of redeeming people and communities and
Yeah.
all that stuff.
Well, and I think it's just striking. In the season 2 of this podcast, we did a lot on trauma, and I had someone where we just talked about, Jesus, the man of trauma, from
Hmm.
was it Isaiah 53. Usually it's the man of sorrows, right? But the man of trauma, and it's unique that we as Christians follow the weak, the vulnerable hero, or the savior who dies,
Hmm.
and that is a way of receiving back our own low anthropology. But then, the great reversal is, well, then we get all of the divinity in the
Hmm.
midst of that, and that the divinity is the linking of these two things. And yeah,
Yeah, I would say, Jeff, I think that the Holy Spirit is alive and active, and like without that piece, you can be thrown onto a sort of a darker view. But I as a Christian, I just don't do. I always have. There's always hope,
amen.
and you see that in as much grief as the church gets, and rightly so. If you've ever been a part of a church that really does preach the grace of God over and over and over again. By the way, I think that it's not a one-time thing; it's every day, every week
Amen.
thing, and in which people are leading from their weakness, and there's transparency and there's forgiveness. I think that's the most beautiful, glimpse of the kingdom you can receive.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again so much for pulling some of these things together, pulling together, this cultural view, as well as, the best of these psychological approaches. please check out David's book, Low Anthropology. Where can people find you? Where are you up to, on our screens of distraction that, shatter our ability to embrace our limitations?
Yeah. Jeez. You can find me on Mockingbird, which is mbird.com. And also I host the Mockingcast, which is on Apple and Spotify and all the places where podcasts are. I'm doing a book tour right now. I'm going to be in Texas over the sort of Halloween weekend. I'll be back in time for Halloween if you're my children and you're listening. And then I'll be in Minneapolis in the middle of November. So all that you can find mbird.com/low anthropology. You can find out where I'm going to tour the book. But
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. And for all of you who are listening or watching this, you can please like and subscribe, follow on the YouTube channel, which is my full name, Geoffrey Holsclaw. Otherwise, you can search Embodied Faith Podcast. It'll pop right up. Please follow along. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, let's do this again.
Love to.